Silence fell across the underground bunker in Berlin as the distant thunder of Soviet artillery crept closer with every passing hour. Adolf Hitler, the man who had commanded millions and terrorized a continent, now paced restlessly beneath layers of concrete and steel. His hands trembled, his eyes darted. This was not the fear of death alone. It was something deeper, more personal, and far more revealing. What, in the final collapse of his empire, did Adolf Hitler fear more than anything else? From the earliest years of his life, fear shaped Hitler as much as ambition did. Born in 1889 in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he grew up in a rigid household ruled by authority and punishment. His father's dominance left him with a lasting hatred of weakness and submission, while his repeated failures as a young artist in Vienna planted a quiet terror of insignificance. Rejection haunted him. Poverty humiliated him. From these experiences emerged a man obsessed with control, recognition, and destiny. Long before he feared enemies on the battlefield, Hitler feared being ignored, forgotten, or exposed as ordinary. The trauma of Germany's defeat in the First World War transformed that private insecurity into a political obsession. Hitler believed Germany had not been defeated militarily, but betrayed from within. This belief hardened into a paranoid fear of internal enemies, Jews, communists, intellectuals, and anyone who challenged his narrative. His speeches did not merely promise greatness. They fed on fear, warning of annihilation, decay, and humiliation. Power, to Hitler, was not simply a tool to rule. It was a shield against chaos, doubt, and the terrifying possibility that his worldview was false. As he rose to power in the 1930s, Hitler's greatest fear became clear: loss of control. He centralized authority relentlessly, dismantling democratic institutions and silencing dissent. The Night of the Long Knives in 1934 revealed this fear in blood. Former allies were executed not because they were an immediate threat, but because Hitler could not tolerate unpredictability. Loyalty mattered less than obedience. Fear of betrayal drove him to trust fewer and fewer people, creating a regime where terror replaced truth and sycophancy replaced honest counsel. This fear followed him into war. Early victories reinforced his belief in destiny, but setbacks awakened a darker anxiety. Hitler feared reality itself, facts that contradicted his vision. As the war turned against Germany, he rejected intelligence reports, dismissed generals, and clung to fantasy. Retreat was forbidden. Defeat was unthinkable. His fear of appearing weak led to catastrophic decisions, most notably on the Eastern Front, where millions of soldiers and civilians perished as Hitler refused to acknowledge military reality. One fear-driven decision led to another, each amplifying the destruction. Yet beneath all these fears lay the one Hitler could never confront openly: fear of being wrong. His ideology claimed absolute truth, racial destiny, and historical inevitability. To admit error would mean admitting that the suffering he unleashed had no higher purpose. This terror of moral exposure fueled the regime's escalating brutality. As defeat loomed, violence intensified. Entire cities were destroyed, and millions more were condemned to death, not to win the war, but to avoid facing failure. In the final months of his life, Hitler's fear reached its purest form. Cut off from the world above, abandoned by allies, and surrounded by the ruins of his own making, he issued orders to destroy Germany's infrastructure, punishing the very people he claimed to lead. If his vision could not survive, he believed nothing deserved to. His fear had transformed into nihilism. Control had become more important than survival. When Hitler ended his life in April 1945, the war in Europe was nearly over, but the consequences of his fears were only beginning. Tens of millions were dead, cities lay in ashes, families were erased. The world was left to confront the horrifying truth that one man's unchecked fear, fused with ideology and power, could unleash devastation on a scale previously unimaginable. Hitler's biggest fear was never death, nor even defeat. It was the fear of losing control, of being exposed, of facing a reality that challenged his sense of destiny. History teaches us that when fear governs power, compassion dies, truth collapses, and humanity pays the price. This is not merely the story of one dictator, but a warning etched into the ruins of the 20th century, a reminder that the most dangerous fear is not the one that trembles in silence, but the one that demands absolute power to hide from itself. From the earliest moments of Adolf Hitler's life, fear was not a passing emotion, but a shaping force, quietly molding his character long before he ever held power. His deepest and most enduring fear was the fear of losing control, a fear rooted in personal failure, humiliation, and insecurity. This fear did not emerge suddenly when he became a dictator. It grew slowly, fed by rejection, frustration, and a desperate need to matter in a world that had repeatedly denied him recognition. Hitler was born in 1889 into a rigid and often oppressive household. His father, Adolf Hitler, was authoritarian, quick-tempered, and demanding, instilling in his son a harsh understanding of power as domination rather than responsibility. As a child, Hitler learned that weakness invited punishment and that obedience was enforced through fear. This environment left him deeply conflicted. He resented authority, yet he craved it. He despised submission, yet feared chaos even more. From an early age, control became synonymous with safety. As a young man in Vienna, this fear of insignificance intensified. Hitler dreamed of becoming an artist, imagining a future of recognition and cultural importance. Instead, he faced repeated rejection from the Academy of Fine Arts. Each rejection struck at his sense of destiny. Poverty followed. He lived in shelters, sold paintings for survival, and watched others succeed where he failed. These years were not merely difficult, they were humiliating. They planted a powerful terror within him, the fear of being ordinary, forgotten, or exposed as talentless and irrelevant. Rather than accepting personal responsibility, he externalized blame, convincing himself that shadowy forces were responsible for his failures. This psychological shift would later define his politics. The First World War temporarily masked these insecurities. Military service gave Hitler structure, purpose, and a sense of belonging. Germany's defeat in 1918 shattered this fragile stability. For Hitler, the collapse of the German Empire was not just a national tragedy, it was a personal catastrophe. He could not accept that Germany had been defeated through military failure. Instead, he embraced the myth of betrayal, believing the nation had been stabbed in the back by internal enemies. This belief was emotionally convenient. It allowed him to avoid confronting reality and preserved his fragile sense of meaning. Fear of humiliation transformed into fear of internal collapse. As Hitler entered politics, this fear hardened into obsession. He believed that without absolute control, society would descend into decay and chaos. Democratic debate, compromise, and pluralism terrified him because they introduced uncertainty. To Hitler, uncertainty meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant annihilation. His speeches were designed not just to inspire, but to frighten. He spoke of enemies everywhere, of conspiracies and threats, creating a world in which only he could provide order. Power became his armor against fear. Once in office, Hitler moved quickly to eliminate anything that limited his authority. Civil liberties were dismantled, opposition parties crushed, and the press silenced. These actions were not simply ideological, they were psychological. Hitler could not tolerate dissent because dissent suggested he might be wrong, and being wrong was unbearable. The more power he accumulated, the more terrified he became of losing it. This paradox defined his rule. Control fed fear, and fear demanded even greater control. The Night of the Long Knives in 1934 exposed this fear in its most violent form. Hitler ordered the execution of former allies within his own movement, men who had helped him rise to power. Their crime was not immediate rebellion, but perceived unpredictability. Hitler feared that independent centers of influence threatened his dominance. Loyalty was no longer enough. Obedience without question was required. The purge sent a clear message across Germany: uncertainty would be met with death. Fear became the glue that held the regime together. This obsession with control extended into military affairs. Early victories reinforced Hitler's belief in his own infallibility. He saw success as proof that his instincts were superior to those of generals and experts. But beneath this confidence lay deep insecurity. When the war began to turn against Germany, Hitler's fear of losing control intensified. He dismissed generals who offered realistic assessments and surrounded himself with those who echoed his wishes. Intelligence reports that contradicted his expectations were ignored or rewritten. Reality itself became the enemy. His refusal to retreat on the Eastern Front was driven not by strategic logic, but by psychological terror. Retreat symbolized weakness. Acknowledging defeat meant admitting error. Entire armies were sacrificed because Hitler could not bear the idea of losing ground. His fear led to catastrophic decisions that prolonged the war and multiplied suffering. Millions of soldiers died not for victory, but to protect one man's illusion of control. As Germany's situation deteriorated, Hitler's fear became more destructive. He no longer trusted the German people, believing they had failed him. In the final months of the war, he ordered the destruction of Germany's infrastructure, ensuring that roads, factories, and cities would be ruined. If he could not control the future, he would erase it. This was fear stripped of all restraint, transformed into vengeance against reality itself. In the bunker beneath Berlin, as Soviet forces closed in, Hitler's lifelong fear reached its climax. Stripped of power, isolated from the world, and confronted with undeniable defeat, he faced the very thing he had spent his life avoiding. He was not a chosen savior. He was not infallible. He was wrong. Rather than face this truth, he chose death, clinging to control over his own end when all other control had vanished. The consequences of this fear were catastrophic. Tens of millions died. Entire nations were scarred. Families were erased. Hitler's personal insecurity, left unchecked and amplified by absolute power, reshaped the world in blood and ashes. His story reveals a chilling truth. The most dangerous leaders are not those driven by strength, but those driven by fear. Fear of weakness, fear of failure, fear of losing control. History does not remember Adolf Hitler as he wished to be remembered. It remembers him as a warning. When insecurity is disguised as destiny and fear is armed with power, the result is not order, but destruction. And this lesson, written in the ruins of the 20th century, remains as urgent today as ever. From the moment Adolf Hitler entered political life, fear of betrayal consumed him like a shadow that never loosened its grip. He did not simply fear enemies beyond Germany's borders. He feared enemies within, imagined, exaggerated, and relentlessly hunted. This fear became one of the most powerful engines behind the creation of the Nazi totalitarian state, shaping its laws, its violence, and its obsession with absolute loyalty. For Hitler, betrayal was not a possibility, it was an inevitability. And to prevent it, he believed every corner of society had to be controlled, watched, and purified. The roots of this fear can be traced to Germany's collapse at the end of the First World War. Hitler was convinced that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, but had been undermined from within. This belief was not supported by evidence, but it offered emotional certainty. It allowed Hitler to explain defeat without accepting military failure or flawed leadership. Instead, blame was placed on civilians, politicians, minorities, and ideological opponents. From this moment onward, Hitler viewed society as a fragile structure, constantly threatened by internal decay. His fear of betrayal was no longer personal. It became political doctrine. As Hitler rose through the ranks of the Nazi Party in the early 1920s, this paranoia intensified. He viewed politics not as a competition of ideas, but as a struggle for survival. Compromise appeared to him as weakness. Opposition was no. Disagreement, it was treason. This mindset shaped the Nazi movement into something rigid and unforgiving, where loyalty to Hitler personally mattered more than competence, truth, or morality. Fear of betrayal demanded emotional submission, not just political alignment. Once Hitler became chancellor in 1933, this fear was transformed into policy. The Reichstag fire became the perfect justification. Presented as proof of an internal communist conspiracy, it allowed Hitler to suspend civil liberties and arrest thousands of political opponents. Whether or not the threat was real mattered less than how effectively it could be used. Fear, once unleashed, justified surveillance, censorship, and mass detention. Germans were taught to see enemies everywhere, and in doing so, they were trained to accept repression as protection. The creation of the Gestapo and the expansion of the SS were direct expressions of Hitler's fear of internal enemies. These organizations were not designed merely to enforce law, but to monitor thought, loyalty, and belief. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Families lived in silence. Trust collapsed. Hitler understood that fear was more powerful than persuasion. A society afraid to speak could not betray him. In this atmosphere, totalitarian control did not require constant violence. The threat alone was enough. Yet Hitler's fear did not spare his own allies. The Night of the Long Knives in 1934 revealed the depth of his paranoia. Leaders of the SA, once celebrated as heroes of the Nazi rise to power, were suddenly declared traitors. Their independence, ambition, and popularity frightened Hitler. He feared they might challenge his authority or destabilize his relationship with the army. In response, he ordered their execution without trial. This massacre was not a strategic necessity. It was psychological reassurance. It proved that no one, regardless of loyalty or service, was beyond suspicion. After this purge, the message was unmistakable. Allegiance to Hitler was absolute and permanent. Doubt, independence, or deviation would be interpreted as betrayal. The state became an extension of Hitler's anxiety, enforcing conformity with ruthless efficiency. Laws multiplied, regulating speech, behavior, relationships, and identity. Fear was no longer just a tool of the regime, it became its foundation. Hitler's obsession with internal enemies also drove the regime's racial policies. Jews, Roma, disabled individuals, and other marginalized groups were portrayed as existential threats to the nation. They were accused of corruption, sabotage, and disloyalty. This narrative served a dual purpose. It unified the population against a common enemy and diverted attention from the regime's failures. More importantly, it reassured Hitler by providing a tangible target for his fear. Betrayal was no longer abstract. It had a face, a name, and a fabricated identity. As the war progressed, Hitler's fear deepened rather than diminished. Military defeats intensified his paranoia. He suspected generals, officials, and even ordinary citizens of disloyalty. Assassination attempts, especially the July 1944 plot, confirmed his worst fears and unleashed a new wave of repression. Thousands were executed or imprisoned, often with little evidence. Fear now ruled the regime completely. Rational decision-making collapsed under suspicion and rage. In the final years, Hitler no longer trusted anyone. He isolated himself, both physically and psychologically. Information was filtered to avoid provoking his anger. Reality became distorted. His fear of betrayal ultimately weakened Germany's ability to function, as honest communication disappeared and initiative was punished. The totalitarian system he created to protect himself became a prison of high own making. The consequences of this fear were catastrophic. A society built on suspicion destroyed its own moral foundation. Millions suffered not because they were guilty, but because fear demanded enemies. Hitler's inability to trust created a state where humanity was sacrificed for control, and loyalty was valued more than truth or life itself. In the end, Hitler was betrayed, not by conspirators, but by his own fear. It consumed reason, compassion, and judgment. His totalitarian state collapsed under the weight of paranoia, leaving behind devastation on a scale the world had never seen. History remembers this not merely as tyranny, but as a warning. When fear of betrayal governs power, freedom dies first and humanity soon follows. As the Second World War unfolded, Adolf Hitler's fear evolved into something even more dangerous than paranoia or obsession with loyalty. It became a profound refusal to accept reality itself. This fear was not loud or visible at first. It hid behind confidence, certainty, and absolute belief in destiny. But as events began to contradict his vision, Hitler's inability to face facts became one of the most destructive forces of the 20th century, shaping decisions that cost millions of lives and sealed Germany's fate. In the early years of the war, Hitler's gamble appeared justified. The rapid defeat of Poland in 1939, followed by the stunning collapse of France in 1940, reinforced his belief that he possessed an almost supernatural strategic instinct. These victories did more than strengthen Germany's position. They fed Hitler's ego and deepened his distrust of professional expertise. Generals who cautioned restraint were ignored. Advisors who raised concerns were sidelined. Hitler began to see military reality not as something to be analyzed, but as something to be bent to his will. This psychological shift was critical. Hitler no longer believed that facts determined outcomes. He believed belief itself could shape reality. His worldview left no room for uncertainty or correction. To admit error would mean admitting weakness, and weakness was something he feared above all else. From this point forward, denial became policy. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 revealed this fear with brutal clarity. Hitler dismissed warnings about Russia's size, climate, and industrial capacity. He believed the campaign would be swift, decisive, and final. When early advances slowed and resistance hardened, he refused to adapt. Winter clothing was delayed. Supply lines were ignored. Intelligence reports describing Soviet strength were rejected as defeatist exaggerations. Hitler did not merely misunderstand reality. He rejected it because it threatened his self-image as an infallible leader chosen by history. As conditions worsened, Hitler tightened his grip on decision-making. Retreat, a standard military tactic, became forbidden. Entire armies were ordered to hold impossible positions, not because it made strategic sense, but because Hitler could not emotionally tolerate withdrawal. Each refusal to retreat led to greater encirclements, greater losses, and greater desperation. The catastrophe at Stalingrad was the clearest example. Despite overwhelming evidence that the Sixth Army was doomed, Hitler forbade retreat, convinced that willpower could overcome logistics, weather, and enemy strength. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were sacrificed to preserve his illusion of control. This pattern repeated across Europe. When Allied bombing devastated German cities, Hitler insisted on miracle weapons rather than addressing strategic realities. Resources were poured into last-minute projects while civilian suffering mounted. Warnings from economists and engineers were ignored. Hitler feared that acknowledging Germany's weakness would unravel the entire ideological structure he had built. Reality was not inconvenient, it was intolerable. Inside the regime, this fear poisoned communication. Officers and officials learned that honesty invited punishment. Reports were altered to please the Führer. Bad news was softened or delayed. Hitler surrounded himself with those who confirmed his beliefs, not those who challenged them. This isolation deepened his detachment from reality and accelerated catastrophic decision-making. Germany was no longer governed by facts, but by fantasies. As defeat became unavoidable, Hitler's fear transformed into denial on a national scale. He accused the German people themselves of betrayal, claiming they had failed to live up to his vision. In his final orders, he demanded the destruction of Germany's infrastructure, preferring annihilation over survival without his ideology. Bridges, factories, and cities were to be destroyed so that nothing would remain if his dream collapsed. This was fear turned inward, fear of a future he could not control. In the bunker beneath Berlin, as Soviet forces closed in, Hitler's denial reached its final stage. He spoke of imaginary armies and non-existent counterattacks. Maps were studied as if lines on paper could alter reality. The world outside no longer mattered. He had retreated entirely into belief, clinging to illusion because truth was unbearable. The consequences of this refusal to accept reality were devastating. Soldiers died following impossible orders. Civilians suffered as resources were squandered. Germany was reduced to ruins, not solely by enemy action, but by leadership that refused to adapt, retreat, or learn. Hitler's fear of being wrong transformed defeat into total destruction. History shows that Hitler did not lose the war simply because of stronger enemies. He lost because he could not face truth. His fear demanded certainty, and certainty demanded denial. When leaders reject reality, they no longer serve their people, they sacrifice them to preserve their own illusions. This is the enduring lesson of Hitler's downfall. Power that cannot accept truth becomes dangerous beyond measure. Reality does not bend to belief, and history does not forgive denial. When fear silences facts, catastrophe follows, and the cost is paid in human lives. At the heart of Adolf Hitler's most destructive decisions lay a fear more corrosive than defeat or death, the fear of being wrong. This was not a simple reluctance to admit mistakes. It was a profound psychological terror that shaped the escalation of violence and magnified human suffering across Europe. To Hitler, error was not a human condition. It was an existential threat. His ideology claimed absolute truth, historical destiny, and racial inevitability. To admit error would have meant admitting that the vast machinery of suffering he unleashed had no higher purpose. And so, rather than confront the possibility of being wrong, he chose to push forward again and again into deeper brutality. From the moment Hitler seized power, his worldview demanded certainty. Nazi ideology left no room for doubt or revision. The state was built on rigid beliefs about race, loyalty, and destiny, presented not as theories, but as facts of nature. Hitler positioned himself as the sole interpreter of these truths. This role made correction impossible. Any challenge to policy could be framed as an attack on destiny itself. As a result, policy failures did not lead to reform, they led to radicalization. This dynamic was visible early in the regime's treatment of political opponents. When repression failed to stabilize society through fear alone, violence intensified. Arrests became mass detentions. Detentions became executions. Each Saint EP was justified not as cruelty, but as necessity. Hitler could not accept that repression created resistance. Instead, resistance was taken as proof that repression had not gone far enough. The solution to failure was always escalation. The same pattern governed racial policy. Anti-Jewish laws initially aimed to isolate and exclude. When these measures did not produce the imagined social transformation promised by ideology, they hardened. Exclusion became expulsion. Expulsion became imprisonment. Imprisonment became extermination. At every stage, Hitler and his inner circle faced a choice: reconsider the assumptions driving policy, or intensify action to force reality to conform. Fear of being wrong ensured the latter. Millions paid the price for a belief system that could not tolerate contradiction. War amplified this fear to catastrophic levels. Early victories validated Hitler's sense of infallibility, but setbacks exposed the fragility beneath it. When military decisions failed, he did not adjust strategy, he questioned loyalty. Generals who reported unfavorable outcomes were dismissed. Officers who urged caution were accused of defeatism. Acknowledging strategic error would have undermined the myth of the infallible leader. To preserve that myth, Hitler demanded greater sacrifices, harsher discipline, and increasingly impossible objectives. Nowhere was this more devastating than on the Eastern Front. As losses mounted, Hitler ordered soldiers to fight to the last man, forbidding retreat, even when encirclement was certain. The human cost was staggering. Entire armies were destroyed not to gain advantage, but to protect Hitler from the humiliation of admitting miscalculation. Soldiers froze, starved, and died in vast numbers because one man feared the moral weight of being wrong more than the lives under his command. This fear also shaped the regime's response to civilian suffering. Allied bombing campaigns devastated German cities, killing tens of thousands and displacing millions. Rather than reconsider the course of the war or seek an end to the conflict, Hitler doubled down. Civilian losses were reframed as proof of enemy barbarism and as justification for total war. Suffering became a tool to reinforce ideology. To acknowledge that continued war only multiplied civilian deaths would have been to admit responsibility, and responsibility was unbearable. As defeat approached, the escalation reached its most nihilistic form. Hitler's orders in the final months of the war reveal a man consumed by the terror of moral exposure. He commanded the destruction of Germany's own infrastructure, ensuring that cities, factories, and transportation networks would be reduced to ruins. This was not strategy, it was punishment. If his vision had failed, then the nation itself, he believed, had failed him. Better that everything be destroyed than that history reveal his errors. The concentration camps, too, reflected this fear-driven escalation. As the war turned against Germany, killings increased rather than slowed. Resources were diverted from the front to continue mass murder, even when it weakened the war effort. This irrational persistence was not accidental. Ending the killing would have implied that it was wrong to begin with. So it continued, relentlessly, until the very end. Human beings were reduced to evidence in a twisted attempt to prove ideological consistency. Inside the regime, fear of being wrong silenced conscience and reason alike. Officials competed to demonstrate ideological purity through harsher measures. Moderation became dangerous. To hesitate was to invite suspicion. Violence became a language of loyalty. In this environment, cruelty was not only permitted, it was rewarded. The system did not merely allow erring, it required it. In the final days, isolated in his bunker, Hitler confronted the collapse of everything he claimed to represent. Yet even then, he clung to illusion. Imaginary armies and non-existent victories filled his conversations. Acknowledging error would have meant facing the millions who died because of his decisions. It would have meant recognizing that his certainty was built on lies and fear. Instead, he chose death, preserving control over his narrative to the very end. The consequences of this fear were immeasurable. Europe was left scarred by mass graves, shattered cities, and generations of trauma. Entire communities vanished. Families were erased. The suffering was not an accidental byproduct of war. It was the direct result of a leader who could not admit error and a system that transformed fear into policy. History's judgment is clear. Adolf Hitler's refusal to accept the possibility of being wrong turned ideology into a weapon of mass destruction. His fear demanded consistency at any cost, and humanity paid that cost in blood. This stands as a universal warning. When leaders value their own certainty above human life, violence becomes limitless. The greatest danger is not flawed ideas alone, but the terror of admitting they are flawed. In the final act of Adolf Hitler's life, fear no longer hid behind confidence, ideology, or ambition. It stood exposed, raw, and absolute. Stripped of power, surrounded by ruins, and abandoned by the illusion of destiny, Hitler confronted the collapse of everything he had built. His final days were not defined by courage or conviction, but by nihilism, a belief that if he could not control the future, then the future itself did not deserve to exist. This final fear-driven descent reveals how a lifetime of insecurity, obsession with power, and hatred of weakness ultimately turned inward, consuming not only but the very meaning of leadership and responsibility. By early 1945, Germany was militarily defeated, though Hitler refused to acknowledge it. Allied forces advanced from the west, while the Soviet army closed in from the east. Cities were reduced to rubble. Supply lines collapsed. Millions of civilians fled or starved. Yet inside his bunker beneath Berlin, Hitler clung to fantasy. Maps were studied obsessively, imaginary divisions were moved, and non-existent counterattacks were planned. Reality, now undeniable, was treated as an enemy to be ignored. Hitler's fear had reached its final form, fear of a future he could not dominate. This fear manifested as bitterness toward the German people themselves. Hitler had always claimed to embody the nation's will, but when the nation could no longer fulfill his vision, he turned against it. He declared that the German people had failed him, that they were too weak to deserve survival. This was a revealing moment. For all his talk of destiny and national greatness, Hitler's loyalty was never truly to Germany, but to his own image of control. Once that image shattered, empathy vanished. In March 1945, Hitler issued what became known as the Nero Decree, ordering the destruction of Germany's infrastructure. Bridges, factories, power plants, transportation systems, everything that could sustain civilian life was to be destroyed. This order was not meant to slow the enemy, it was meant to erase the future. If Germany could not exist under his rule, then it should not exist at all. This was fear transformed into vengeance. Control was no longer about winning, it was about denying life beyond his authority. This moment reveals the ultimate consequence of fear fused with absolute power. Hitler's lifelong terror of losing control had now turned into a desire for annihilation. He preferred total destruction over survival without dominance. Millions of civilians, already exhausted and suffering, were condemned further by orders driven not by necessity, but by spite. Only the quiet defiance of some officials prevented complete implementation of this madness. Inside the bunker, Hitler's isolation deepened. He trusted no one fully. Conversations grew erratic. Hope was replaced by delusion. He spoke of betrayal everywhere, even as loyalty surrounded him. This paranoia was not new. It was the culmination of a lifetime spent fearing exposure, weakness, and irrelevance. Without power, Hitler was forced to confront the emptiness beneath his authority. Rather than face it, he withdrew into fantasy. The final days were marked by despair, disguised as resolve. Hitler married Eva Braun, a symbolic gesture meant to impose order on chaos. He distributed poison capsules. He dictated a political testament filled with blame, denial, and hatred. There was no remorse, no acknowledgement of suffering, no recognition of the millions dead because of his choices. His fear would not allow reflection. Reflection required accountability, and accountability required admitting failure. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler ended his life. In doing so, he retained control over the only thing he could still command, his own death. This act was not bravery, It was the final assertion of dominance in a world where dominance was gone. Death became his escape from judgment, from history, and from truth. Yet even in death, the consequences of his fear continued to unfold. Germany lay in ruins, Europe was shattered, tens of millions were dead, entire cultures had been scarred beyond repair, families searched for names that would never be found, cities rebuilt themselves over mass graves. The cost of one man's fear, amplified by ideology and unchecked authority, was written across a continent. What makes this ending so haunting is not merely the scale of destruction, but its cause. Adolf Hitler did not destroy Germany because he loved it too much. He destroyed it because he could not bear a world he did not control. His fear of insignificance, his terror of being wrong, and his obsession with domination ultimately erased any capacity for compassion. Power, once meant to protect him from fear, became the instrument through which fear annihilated everything else. History judges Hitler not as a tragic figure, but as a warning. His downfall exposes a universal truth. When leaders fear loss of control more than human suffering, they become capable of unimaginable cruelty. When ideology replaces humility and certainty replaces conscience, destruction becomes inevitable. The ruins of 1945 remind us that fear, when armed with power, does not merely corrupt, it devastates. Adolf Hitler's final collapse teaches the world that leadership without accountability leads not to greatness but to ruin. And it stands as a permanent warning to humanity. The greatest danger is not the enemy outside, but the fear within. When given absolute power over the fate of others,